What a terrible way to play hide and seek. Alright, today we're going to be looking at the horror film It Follows. First appearing at the Cannes Film Festival in 2014, it got a wider theatrical release in 2015. And this was a movie I just happened to stumble upon one day when kind of just looking for different horror movies to sort of get into. Decided to give this one a shot, and I liked it a lot. And for the most part, I still do really like it a lot, and I'll kind of get into that a bit later. This movie was directed by David Robert Mitchell, and apparently the idea came from dreams he would have, well, more so nightmares, where he was being chased by someone or something just following him, and obviously he got that made into a horror movie. Getting into the movie itself, it starts off with this girl, Annie Marshall, who runs out of her house and is running around the street looking at something we obviously don't see. Then she runs inside, grabs car keys, and leaves. She goes to a beach where she calls her dad, and she waits there, and it cuts to her dead body on the beach with a pretty gnarly bent backwards leg. Following the intro, we are introduced to Jay. She is going on a date with a guy named Hugh, and at a theater, Hugh points out a lady that Jay cannot see. He becomes unnerved and leaves. On the next date, they get up to some adult stuff in Hugh's car. Afterwards, Hugh incapacitates Jay with chloroform and has her tied to a wheelchair, where he tells her that now there is an entity that will follow her. It is passed on through sex, and only the people who have gotten it can see it. It can take on the form of anyone, whether it's someone she knows or doesn't know, and it will always be moving at a walking pace and will know where she is at all times. If it catches her, it'll kill her, and then it'll move on to the next person down the line, so to speak, which obviously would be Hugh. Hugh waits for the entity to show up so that Jay can see it, and then he takes her back home. Hugh takes off. It's found out that the police cannot find him because he was under a false identity. Soon after at school, Jay looks out the window and sees an old woman in a hospital gown approaching her. She leaves the classroom where it follows her through to school. She meets up with some of her friends, and they agree to stay over at her house. That night, while talking to her friend Paul, they hear a window break in the kitchen. Jay goes to investigate and sees a woman in there, and she runs upstairs. Eventually, her sister and her friends come in, along with a terrifying tall guy. I cannot stress enough how freaking scary this scene is, dear God. But she gets out of the house, go finds a place to sort of rest for a bit. Her friends chase after her, including this guy across the street named Greg. Then they go to find Hugh. They investigate where he was staying at, which eventually leads them to his school and to his home, where he then kind of confirms everything with Jay, and all the friends hear this, and Greg obviously doesn't believe it, and we get a pretty funny fake out right here. Greg then takes everyone to his family's lake house. Jay learns how to shoot, and they kind of just get there to relax a little and give Jay some time to think. The next day though, while Greg goes off to relieve himself, Jay's friend Yara is approaching behind her. But wait a second, that's Yara in the water. Of course, this is the entity who grabs her by the hair, and everyone but Greg seems to see it. Paul attacks it with a chair, but he is very violently knocked away. They flee to the boathouse, but the entity breaks in, and Jay ends up running out, steals the vehicle, but gets into a crash down the road. She ends up in the hospital, and while in the hospital, Greg sleeps with her. Everything seems okay for a bit. Jay doesn't see anything, nothing's happening with Greg, until one night where Jay sees Greg break into his own house. She runs over and sees Greg's mother knocking on Greg's bedroom door. When he opens it up, she pounces on him, and this being the entity, Greg is killed. Jay takes off. She drives very far away. She ends up just kind of staying in the woods, I guess, but she walks out onto a beach where she sees three men in a boat, and she starts to undress and walk into the water. She then returns home where Paul, who is down extremely bad, tries to get Jay to pass it on to him, but she refuses. The group comes up with a plan to try to get rid of the entity, and they leave to go to a pool, but of course on the way out they see the entity on a rooftop, and a pretty freaky scene, I think. They plan to get the entity into the water and electrocute it. Eventually it does show up, and there's a bit of a hassle going on with them trying to hurt it, even though they can't see it. Eventually they use a blanket to kind of see the thing. It's throwing the devices that they were going to use to electrocute it in the pool at Jay. So she's getting hurt, but eventually it is shot and it falls into the pool. It grabs Jay, but thankfully Paul is able to shoot it in the head, and when Jay checks to see what's going on, the pool is filling up with blood. We then see back at Jay's house that her and Paul are engaging in adult activity. So, you know, if nothing worked then, he now has it. Then after that, we see Paul driving through town, including going by some prostitutes that he's looking at. We also see that Yara, who I forgot to mention got accidentally shot at the pool, is recovering in the hospital and everything seems to be going well. In the last bit of the film, we see Jay and Paul walking down the street holding hands, where everything seems to be normal, but down the street behind them, we can see someone or something walking. So yeah, that's It Follows. I think the story's pretty good, pretty basic, but it doesn't need to be anything super extravagant. I think it does a good job of showing and explaining kind of the rules with the monster. There are definitely some questions that I have, some things I'll get into a bit later. That's good. I think the characters are good. I enjoy how it kind of leaves things up to your interpretation at the end. So yeah, I think it's a very solid story. As for the characters, you know, I like Jay as a main character. For the little bit of time we see him, I actually do kind of enjoy Hugh, or as we later learn, Jeff. He's obviously very desperate to just get rid of this thing. I do like Paul, even if he's a bit awkward. It's just like, my guy, do you really care about Jay this much, or are you just like, bro, I'm just trying to get some? I don't understand it, because he's just like, hey, I know this thing might kill me, but you should give it to me. Like, what are you doing, guy? I actually like Greg. It really sucks that he just kind of died. And I enjoy Yara too. She doesn't really do a whole lot, but I liked her. I feel like Jay's sister Kelly is just kind of there. Yeah, she doesn't really do a whole lot. So the characters in the film, they're pretty basic, some pretty one note, but I like them for what they are. You know, they help move the story along and everything. Moving on to how scary this movie is, I think this one is pretty frightening. Whether it's the basic concept of this thing following you wherever you go and it's constantly coming after you no matter what, or even some of the specific scenes, the tall guy coming out of the darkness like that just legitimately spooks me. Or even another simple thing like when the old lady is following Jay through the school and Jay calls out and only the other students answer, and of course the blank stare that the thing has, like, it's freaky. What I like is this movie's not really in your face scary. It's a lot more of like a simple scary. I'm not really sure how else to describe it. I'll take that over this big extravagant stuff most of the time. Moving on to the kills, there's really only two unless you count them killing the monster in the end. Again, we'll kind of get to that. But honestly, I think my favorite of the movie might go to the off-screen death at the start. I just feel like that's one that can really play into the imagination and just the imagery whenever we see it with the leg bent backwards and stuff. Like, it's pretty brutal. Don't get me wrong, Greg's death is very brutal and really messed up when you look at what's happening in that scene. I'm not going to show it here, but it's messed up. But yeah, just the imagery of that, especially with starting off the movie like that, I like it a lot. And I feel like it's pretty rare for a off-screen death to really work like that, you know? And just kind of touching on various aspects of the movie that I do enjoy. I really do like that opening scene, not just because of the kill itself, but I feel like it really sets the tone of everything. You know, it kind of throws you into just the middle of it, and you kind of have to piece everything together yourself, some of which you won't be able to until, obviously, later. You know, this scene also has another thing that I enjoy with this movie, which is the one takes that they do, you know, where they'll just be a long scene where like the camera might kind of rotate and stuff, or might move along with a character or something, like Jay in the wheelchair. And it's just very cool stuff. I really enjoyed that. And I really like the score. I find it to be very sort of video gamey, which I don't use in like a negative way or anything, but just sounds kind of video gamey to me. But I think it really works. I feel like it adds a certain atmosphere to the movie. The score was done by Disaster Piece, and I think it's very well done. Now, there's a couple things in the movie that I do find a little odd. I recall seeing where, I can't remember if it was the director or not, but someone behind the scenes was kind of saying that, like, you know, they wanted a sort of timeless feel to the movie or something like that. And that's why, you know, while it kind of has a modern day feel, or at least, you know, modern day in 2014, we mostly see a lot of older cars. They're watching older movies on an old TV. But then you have stuff like Yara, who has, it's like a makeup mirror, but it's like a tablet or something. And as far as I know, I don't think those exist, or at least they didn't exist then. Again, as far as I know, maybe I'm completely wrong on that. I just find that approach to everything pretty interesting. It definitely kind of adds to this sort of the dreamlike feel of the movie. And then of course, again, even though I think everything is explained pretty well, there are some things with the entity that is, you know, a little confusing. Like for me, is it just regular sex, you know, intercourse that can pass the thing on, or is it any kind of sexual activity? I'll be damned if I'm gonna have a monster chase after me after getting just a handy. And you know, even if it sounds weird, I do understand why intercourse would be the thing if that is the case. It's just like, damn, imagine getting that Hobby Lobby salami nobby and she's just like, I may have taken your soul, but that's about to take your life, and then you get freaking yoinked out of the car. I don't know. It's just, I feel like that could maybe have been a bit more clear, but I also feel feel like to a point, especially with how the movie is presented, we know what we need to know. There's just some things I would like to know more about, I guess, which kind of sucks because I remember one of the people behind the scenes saying they'd love to see a sequel where Jay or maybe another protagonist went down the line to, you know, find the origin of the thing, which I think that could be pretty cool, especially since It Follows was a pretty successful movie, had a pretty low budget. It didn't make like a whole lot of money at the box office, but it was definitely successful and it was reviewed very well. Critics definitely loved it, and from what I've been able to tell, most audiences liked it. I've watched this film several times with various friends and most seem to enjoy it, at least to some degree. There's definitely a few that don't really like it. They feel it's too slow or something like that. If you had asked me a few years ago how I felt about the movie, I'd be like, oh yeah, I loved it. Like one of my favorite horror movies of all time. I do feel like my opinion on this movie has dropped a little bit after watching it again for this video. I don't need something happening every 5 minutes or anything like that, but there are some bits that are just slow, but it also helps set a mood, set a tone, so I'm kind of like half and half on that. I do feel like it's pretty successful in being scary. Definitely has some, in my opinion, just terrifying scenes. You know, I feel like it's very effective as a horror movie, even if I might not think quite as highly about it now as I did, say, 2016 or something like that. But tell me, what do you think about It Follows? Have you seen it? Do you like it? Why or why not? And how do you think you'd be able to defeat the entity? Let me know down in the comments. Before we go, I want to give a big thanks to Austin Gillis, currently still the only one in my highest tier on Patreon, so I want to give a big thanks to him. And if you'd like to check out my Patreon, please check out the link in the description. As always, I want to give a big thanks to everyone for watching, and have a good one.